Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another segment of our Cybersecurity and Data Privacy webinar series. I'm Emily Rouleau. I'm an associate with PilieroMazza's Business and Transactions Group. I also work a little bit in the GovCon group and obviously as part of our Cybersecurity and Data Privacy team. Today I have my coworker Anna Wright with us, and I'll turn it over to Anna so she can introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Anna. That's me on the slide there. As you can see, I do a lot of government contracting, small business work, a lot of set-asides, that sort of thing. I also do, obviously, a lot of cybersecurity work as well, including a lot of things at CMMC and things like FAR 52204-21 and defrost clauses and all that kind of stuff, a little bit of which we are going to talk about today. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Anna. So just a quick bit about our firm. We are a full service firm. We work in business and transactions, government contracts, labor and employment, and litigation. So if there are items that Anna and I don't have time to cover today or isn't part of the scope of this presentation, but you have questions about or want to follow up with us afterwards, we are happy to talk after the presentation or via email. So our contact information will be posted later, and just let us know if you have any further questions. So today we are going to discuss essential cybersecurity and data privacy planning for small businesses. We'll be breaking down the presentation into four main areas. So first, we're going to discuss general considerations for why cybersecurity and data privacy matter. Anna's going to just talk about basic cybersecurity measures and some recommendations that you and your businesses can take. Then we will shift towards data privacy in particular and discuss the types of information you should protect, as well as some of our recommendations regarding data privacy. Again, this will be kind of a broad overview of things to consider for you and your small businesses, and recommendations that we have as to how you can address any issues and make sure that you're protecting information as best as possible.
Yeah, so like Emily said, I'm going to talk a little bit about why cybersecurity and data privacy matter, or in other words, why should I care? As you can see there, nearly $1 trillion were lost in 2020 alone due to cybercrime. And cybercrime is anything from somebody quote unquote hacking into your system to a scam to basically anything that uses a computer to do a bad thing. That's cybercrime. But the losses, that $1 trillion amount, that's not just because somebody got into somebody else's system and stole a bunch of their money. That does happen, but that's not the only loss. The loss is also due to downtime, due to because of somebody getting into your system. You have to get your system back, and you have to get it running again without this bad actor in it. So that's recovery. That can be very expensive. Loss of intellectual property and trade secrets. Because it's not just money that is valuable. People have sensitive data that's trade secrets and so forth that can cause a really significant dent in revenues if that stuff gets out. So and reputation as well. So a lot of losses can be because of those issues too. The average cost of remediating a quote-unquote cybersecurity incident, so that would be something, like somebody getting into your system, more or less, is about $500,000 in 2019. The statistics for 2020 are a little higher than 2019. The data is just not quite as complete yet, so that's why we have the 2019 number there. But the point is, remediating an incident is very expensive, and it's really not something that you want to that you want to be doing. It's much, much cheaper and easier overall to stave off the incident as opposed to have it happen and then have to recover. And then in 2020 and 2021, there were a lot of big upticks in ransomware and phishing attacks. And by big upticks, I mean like a standard deviation kind of uptick. So it's a big difference from other previous years. That's in large part due to remote work environments because of COVID. And those environments make companies more vulnerable to these types of attacks. There are a couple of reasons for that vulnerability. One is that a lot of companies are now realizing, well, gosh, we have to give people a way to get into our systems remotely. Specifically, we have to give our employees a way to get into our systems remotely. But not everyone is securing their systems well. So yes, they are giving employees access to their systems, which good, yeah, we need to do that. But that can also sometimes inadvertently give bad actors access as well. If maybe employees just aren't guarding their login credentials as well as they should, if they, have their username as username and their password as password, stuff like that. It can give bad actors an easy way into your system. Same with phishing attacks. A lot of times, if you were in an office, you could just kind of pop down the hall and be like, "Hey, is this email legit? Like, did you send this?" Not so in the remote work environment quite as much, because now you have to either email the person back, or you have to call them, or text them, or whatever. And a lot of people don't really want to bug someone about just a funny-looking little email. So that kind of adds to the vulnerability there. So kind of digging down a little more into why that matters. A lot of companies will store employees' personally identifiable information, like their social security numbers and a number of other items. Emily's going to explain a little bit more about that later. Also, several states now impose certain data privacy requirements that apply to that PII, that's the personal identifiable information, and other customer information and sensitive information that companies might store, whether that's on their website, their server, whatever. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier with the FAR 52204-21, federal contractors are often subject to specific cybersecurity requirements. The general one is that clause that I keep mentioning, and I'm going to keep mentioning, even though not everyone here is going to be a federal contractor, but I'll explain why it makes sense later. So here's why it makes sense. The vast majority of federal contractors are required to comply with 15 safeguards in that FAR clause that I keep banging on about. The clause applies, as you can see here, whenever a contractor will have quote unquote federal contract information, whether it's residing in or transiting through its systems. And a lot of contracts are just themselves considered federal contract information, which kind of seems like a no-brainer. But essentially, it's federal contract information is stuff that's not supposed to be public. It's not controlled and classified information. It's not necessarily classified. There is overlap, of course, because federal contract information is a very large umbrella. But broadly, it's just things that you probably don't want to be public that relate to a federal contract. And these 15 safeguards that are in FAR 52204-21 are designed to protect the federal contract information that is in or transits through someone's system. Of course, residing in means you're storing it somewhere in your system, whether that's in your OneDrive, your actual computers. I'm grabbing my computer right now. I can't see it, but I am. It could be transiting through as in like it goes through your email, and then you just send it off to somebody else. But all of that means there's federal contract information. It's somewhere in your system, and the safeguards apply. Now, if you're not a federal contractor, you're probably looking at this and going, well, that's neat. Why do I care? Great question. Because these 15 safeguards are kind of designed to be basic cybersecurity that is accessible for everyone. It's meant to be just a sort of baseline so that any type of sensitive information that you're storing on your system is like bare minimum covered. So even if you're not a federal contractor, which my understanding is a lot of you on the line are federal contractors, but even if you're not, these 15 safeguards that we have in the FAR are a really good starting point for you to implement in your systems and kind of start looking into to see what will be helpful to you. So now that I've blabbered on about that for a minute, what are the safeguards? All right. So first, there's limiting information system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of those users or their devices. That includes other information systems. So for example, if you have an outside system that connects to yours, your internal system. Broadly, this just means you need to be able to identify who's accessing your stuff. You can do that with usernames and passwords. That's generally the best way to do it. You can also do it with like geotagging, that sort of thing. There are a lot of ways to do it, but most companies will just simply assign a username and password to somebody. And then when that person wants to access the company's information, they input their username and password, and there you go. Whoever is accessing is now identified. And that kind of bleeds into the second control there. Limit information system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. This is actually something I see people kind of gloss over a lot of companies in particular. A lot of people think, okay, well, I've assigned a username and password to everybody. That's great. So now I can identify who's doing what. But the thing is, you might not want Joe from shipping to be able to mess around in the HR files, right? Because maybe that's information that Joe from shipping isn't supposed to know. But Anne from HR is definitely supposed to be able to access that. So what you're supposed to do there is make sure that only authorized people can access things. So that can be, requiring somebody to input their username and password before accessing certain parts of your systems. And if they don't have credentials that are tied to that part of your system, they just simply can't access it. This is a functionality that's very, very common with pretty much every commercial application that you can get, whether it's Dropbox, OneDrive, etc. But that's something that you can configure fairly easily. And then, of course, you're supposed to verify and control/limit connections to and use of external information systems. So essentially, you just need to make sure that people are not going to the wrong place. So, and that can be, you can use firewalls that you can configure. There are other similar devices and measures that you can use. But broadly, you just want to make sure that you're not typing in a website and then going to the wrong thing. Just making sure that that the wrong person isn't going to the wrong place at the wrong time. That's really all this is meant to get to. All right, then we have control information posted or processed on publicly accessible information systems. So this is usually your website. Probably don't post your trade secrets on your website. Like that's a good rule of thumb. Same goes for federal contract information. Probably don't post that without government approval. Anything that's not supposed to be public shouldn't go on a publicly accessible site. Some people have asked about, well, does OneDrive count as a publicly accessible information system? Not necessarily. It's most OneDrive accounts are generally speaking not publicly accessible because they're your own like private piece of the OneDrive cloud. Same goes for Dropbox. Now, they each have their drawbacks and various vulnerabilities. Like Dropbox in particular is a little bit known for having certain vulnerabilities. But broadly speaking, the publicly accessible information system, that's getting more toward putting things on your website or on somebody else's website, putting up blog posts, news releases, stuff like that. Then we have identify information system users, processes acting on behalf of users or devices. Again, that's usernames and passwords. So assign unique usernames to everybody who needs to access your systems and assign them passwords or have them create their own passwords. But the sort of caution here is you want to make sure that your passwords aren't really easy to guess. So something like password 1234, probably not going to cut it. So you want to make sure that, yes, people can make their own passwords, that sort of thing. That's generally a good thing to have people do. But it's a good rule of thumb to enforce a certain complexity and length standard, just so you're not running into someone having password 1234 as their password, because I'm actually not kidding. People do that a lot, and it sounds funny to a lot of folks who might be on the line. But that is actually one of the ways that bad actors will brute force their way into a system. Is if somebody has a weak password and it's really easy to guess, like it doesn't take much. You just a couple of guesses and somebody's in. That's not good. That's the opposite of the point of the password. So you want to make sure that your passwords are at least somewhat hard to guess. And again, these all kind of bleed into each other a little bit. So going to the next one is authenticate or verify the identities of your users, processes, devices, whatever, as a prerequisite to allowing access to your information systems. So don't just let Joe off the street come in and get into your computers. Lock your computers, things like that. Make sure that if someone's going to access your data, that they do have to input their username and password first, or whatever else you have to restrict things. Then we have sanitize or destroy information system media containing federal contract information before disposing of it or releasing it for reuse. This could apply to your trade secrets too. This is obviously technically a FAR control, but if you have any trade secrets, confidential information, or what have you, residing on a flash drive, for example, you don't want to just toss the flash drive when you're done with it, right? You want to make sure that if somebody were to snoop around in your garbage, which does happen, by the way, as goofy as it sounds, this does happen. So if somebody were to snoop around in your garbage, you would want to make sure that they wouldn't be able to grab that flash drive and then misappropriate a bunch of your information or the government's information. So you want to make sure that you delete that information or you just destroy the flash drive, hard drive, whatever it is that you're using before you dispose of it. And there are a lot of ways you can do that with a hard drive. It's not a hard disk drive. You can degauss it. There are a lot of ways with it, just like a big magnet. There are a lot of ways you can do that. But the gist is just make sure you're not throwing out things that have a bunch of your sensitive information on it. And also within your company, make sure that you're not accidentally giving some, like a disk or a flash drive, a computer, whatever, to somebody that has a bunch of information on it that they're not supposed to have. So if you have a computer that maybe was used for, again, going back to that HR example, that was an HR computer, make sure that you took all of the HR information off that computer before you give it to somebody who's not supposed to have access to that information. You know, it sounds pretty common sense, but a lot of times people don't really think about this because it's like, oh, well, we're all in the same organization, right? So we all kind of share the same goal. Yeah, that's true. But sometimes there are certain confidential things that you might not want all of your employees to know, and that's okay. Just make sure that you keep it private. Then we go to limit your physical access to organizational information systems equipment and the operating environments to authorized individuals. That's a really, really long-winded way of saying, hey, lock your door, give people keys, And make sure that there aren't just things out in the open where, again, somebody could just come in off the street and grab it and take off. That's not good. We don't want that to happen. And we also want to make sure that if there's maybe some more sensitive information, some trade secrets, whatever, in somebody's office, like maybe the CEO's office, you don't want just anybody to be able to waltz in there and grab it. And that includes your employees. So you want to make sure that you have locking doors or some other way to ensure that the wrong people aren't getting access to the wrong things. And typically, for most businesses, this is going to be, make sure your CEO's door locks. Make sure you have a locking door to your whole office. Stuff like that. Or, if you're in a co-working space, make sure you don't leave your computer out on the table that you're working on, totally unlocked with everything accessible when you go to the bathroom. Stuff like that. Then we get into escorting visitors, monitor your visitor activity, maintain audit logs of physical access, and control and manage physical access devices. That's another pretty long-winded control there. Escorting visitors and monitoring visitor activity, that's relatively self-explanatory. Just make sure that you don't have random people wandering around your offices unescorted, because that's not great. You don't want them to be able to access things that they shouldn't. Maintain audit logs of physical access. That can really just be like a piece of paper where people sign in and out. Or a lot of companies now have electronic logs. They have like a key fob they give people, and that will log like who was where at what time. That's another way to do it. But there are a lot of ways that you can have audit logs. It doesn't have to be some huge complicated thing. It can literally just be a piece of paper where people write their name and the time they came in and the time they left. It doesn't have to be a huge deal. And then controlling and managing physical access devices, that's keys, key fobs, anything that you're going to use to get into your office, like a physical thing, like a card, whatever. And we have monitor, control, and protect organizational communications. So that means like information transmitted or received by organizational information systems at the external boundaries and key internal boundaries of those information systems. That, again, is somewhat encompassed in like a firewall. You can use firewalls to do that. It's especially important for the monitor, control piece and protecting. And you just really want to make sure that your systems aren't talking to each other when they shouldn't, and that they're not talking to outside systems when they shouldn't. And perhaps more importantly, that people aren't going into, again, the wrong place the wrong time. So, again, probably seems a little common sense, but just stuff you want to do. And a lot of this, the monitor, control, and protect, a lot of anti-malware applications actually come with something like this now. And things like Outlook even can help with monitoring and controlling. There are ways you can configure it to make sure that it's not sending the wrong things to the wrong people. There are a couple ways you can do that with, whitelisting, blacklisting, etc. Okay. Then we have, you can implement subnetworks for publicly accessible system components that are physically or logically separated from internal networks. So again, I know a lot of this sounds kind of complicated, but it really doesn't have to be. This broadly just means like don't put publicly accessible things in the same place you put things that aren't supposed to be publicly accessible, right? So if you have a server and the server stores certain confidential information, you wouldn't want to have information that you're going to post publicly hosted on that same server and then accessible to the public, right? Not without sequestering it away from the rest of the information, or just having your website hosted on a different server. That's a good way to do it too. And that could be for file sharing sites too, like if you need to share files with an outside company, just, make sure that you're not giving the wrong people access. And that's really what all of this boils down to, is just making sure that you aren't giving the wrong people access to the wrong things. And then next, we've got kind of 4 in a row here that are interrelated a little bit. First, there's identify, report, and correct information and information system flaws in a timely manner. So that could be things like making sure that you have the most recent version of Windows installed if you use Windows. Or, updating your anti-malware software, making sure that all of your security updates are installed on all of your applications and systems and so forth. Just keeping everything up to date so that when a vulnerability becomes known, you patch it up as quickly as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean you do it immediately, because sometimes patches will be released and the patches themselves create other problems. So there's nothing wrong with waiting a little bit just to make sure that the patch actually does what it says on the tin. But the point here is you just want to make sure that things are updated as much as possible and you're not having big gaping holes in your system that are easily patched by simply downloading and installing an update. Then we have provide protection from malicious code at appropriate locations within organizational information systems. Broadly, this can be solved with just installing and enabling anti-malware software, and with firewalls. But of course, a lot of anti-malware software does come with firewalls anymore. You don't necessarily have to get separate firewalls and anti-malware software. You can. There's nothing wrong with getting separate ones. There's nothing wrong with having physical firewalls too. That's good, in fact. But the point is, you just want to make sure that you're not allowing malware to sneak into your system kind of unannounced, and you're ensuring that company systems won't easily be compromised just because there's kind of an open door with welcome mat for malware because there's some place in your system that isn't protected. That doesn't mean everything has to have a big old physical firewall on it at all times. No, just ensure that the basics are covered. This isn't advanced cybersecurity. This is just covering your bases. And that kind of bleeds into the next one then. Update your malicious code protection mechanisms when new releases are available. In regular people words, that pretty much just means update your malware or your anti-malware software. Pretty simple. A lot of anti-malware software will do that for you automatically. You just have to tell it, yes, please do it automatically. But again, if you want to kind of wait a little bit and see if certain updates are going to do what they say they'll do, that's okay. Just make sure that you stay caught up with it and not let months or even years go by without updating things. I have seen that happen for companies, and it is not fun to have to go in and install a bunch of updates for something that may or may not still be supported, and all the vulnerabilities that creates. It's just not fun. So it's a good idea to make sure that everything is updated, but in particular your anti-malware and similar such applications. And finally, we have perform periodic scans of your information system and real-time scans of files from external sources as they are downloaded, opened, or executed. Again, this is something that a lot of anti-malware applications will do for you. You just have to enable it. And a lot of spam blockers as well for emails will do this. So you can enable that function in Outlook, for instance, where it kind of checks the email to make sure that it's up to snuff. Of course, it's not going to catch something like a phishing attack necessarily, especially if it's a very well done phishing attack. But it does give you just a little extra layer to make sure that if things are coming into your system, whether they're emails or what have you, downloads from the internet, things like that, It's just ensuring that they're not going to be made of malware and then just spread all through your system and cause havoc. We don't want that. So just enabling the some of the anti-malware softwares have like weekly scans, some do daily, some do monthly, some do all free. It just depends what you want to do. But broadly, the point is just enable your anti-malware software and ensure that you're taking advantage of its protections wherever you can. All right, so that brings me to the end of the basic cybersecurity measures. And I'll hand it off to Emily. She'll tell you about the types of information that you will need to protect.
Thanks, Anna. So everyone, we're going to shift a little bit more into the data privacy world here, but you'll see that the measures that Anna covered will assist you in protecting information that is sensitive and typically needs to be protected. So data privacy typically refers to the handling and protection of sensitive information. We often think of this as being personal information, your name, your address, your social security number, email addresses, and other information that is linked to you as an individual. But data privacy protections include other forms of sensitive information, including financial information, such as income data or credit card statements. It can also include your internet browsing history, search history, purchases. So I'm sure we've all seen all of the cookies notices now when you are browsing something online or different apps on your phone are asking whether you will allow apps to track and share information between different platforms. Data privacy also includes geolocation data as well as affiliations such as political or religious affiliations. So given the breadth of the data that may fall under data privacy laws, we recommend that you and your small businesses work in 3 steps. So step 1 is going to be identifying the types of information that you or your company maintains and has access to. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth, but think about what your company has, what your databases include. Step 2 is going to be identify the laws that apply to you or your company. And step 3 is going to be implement the required protections or actions under applicable data privacy laws. And if possible, implement other reasonable measures to protect sensitive information. Anna, you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So you will see that in the following slides, I'm going to reference 4 data privacy laws to serve as examples as we go through them. I find that it helps to have concrete examples, but please remember that you need to check your individual states for regulations and laws. In general, so the first one that you'll see reference to is the General Data Protection Regulation, which, or GDPR, which is the toughest privacy and security law in the world. That was passed by the European Union, and it served as a basis for state laws that have passed since then. So you'll see that it served as the base work for the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, which passed in 2018. That's the second one that we reference a lot in this presentation, just to provide, again, those concrete examples. We will also reference the Colorado Privacy Act and the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act, which both of these passed this year and go into effect in 2023. So again, these provide our general framework and illustrations, but and help provide recommendations, but always remember to check individual states' laws. All right, so to go into step 1 in more detail, identify the types of information you or your company maintains and has access to. So do you keep all your employees' personal information? What do you keep in terms of birth dates, social security numbers? How is that information protected? Who has access to that information? And on what types of systems are they maintained? Second is financial information. If you're running a small business, obviously you need to maintain your financial information, your banking information, account information, other credit card information, or employee income information. Do you have customer or consumer information? So if your customers view things online, or do you keep track of purchase patterns or other items to address your customer base? What type of information are you collecting there? And do you maintain other sensitive data? Do you keep information on the diversity of your workforce or the diversity of your employees? Do you ask in the services that you provide for customers to identify their race, religion, or sexual orientation for just diversity and inclusion information? So depending on the types of information that you maintain, you'll need to make sure that you implement the measures that Anna talked about, but also pay attention to which laws apply to you on a state-by-state basis based on where you're located and the type of entity you are and the type of information you maintain, process, or control. So the next step, step 2, identify any and all data privacy laws that apply to your company. So as I just mentioned, there is no overarching law in the US like there is in the EU regarding data privacy. So unfortunately, it's a piecemeal basis, but we are going to reference the 4 main data privacy laws that have come out in the US recently and the EU to serve as a foundation and example for us. So the first thing you need to pay attention to is the fact that each of these laws covers and applies to a different definition of either people or companies. So first, the GDPR applies to anyone who processes personal data of European Union citizens or residents or offers goods or services to European Union citizens or residents, even if you're not in the European Union. So even if your company is not located in or have any offices in the European Union, you may be subject to GDPR's requirements depending on who your customers are and what type of information you're processing and from whom. Second, the CCPA applies to for-profit businesses that do business in California and meet any of the following requirements. Either have a gross annual revenue of over $25 million, buy, receive, or sell the personal information of 50,000 or more California residents, households, or devices, or derive 50% or more of the annual revenue from selling California residents' personal information. So you'll see that the CCPA targets businesses as opposed to and uses for-profit companies with revenues or customer information as opposed to looking at where the people are located. So in California, you have to do business in California and then also meet those requirements. Now, Colorado Privacy Act is a bit broader and applies to any person, commercial entity, or governmental entity that maintains, owns, or licenses personal identifying information or personal information of Colorado residents in the course of its business. So whereas the CCPA applies to for-profit businesses, the Colorado Privacy Act includes individuals and applies to commercial entities as well as government entities. It also has its own definitions of PII and PI. So personally identifiable information includes social security numbers, license plate information, passport numbers, other biometric data. And then Colorado's Privacy Act also includes this definition of personal information, or PI, which involves a combination of information. So PI is considered if you have a Colorado resident's first name or first initial or last name combined with another piece of information. So we've listed them below as an illustration, but Colorado's definitions of information that falls under its law are obviously broad and very inclusive, and you have to pay attention to whether you by a combination of information also fall under the PI definition and not just PII. Lastly, the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act applies to businesses that conduct business in Virginia or produce or products or services that target Virginia residents, and that either during a calendar year control or process personal data of at least 100,000 consumers, or control or process personal data of at least 25,000 consumers and derive over 50% of their gross revenue from the sales of personal data. So again, Virginia applies to businesses. You have to conduct business in Virginia or produce products or services that target Virginia residents. And then there are these requirements as to what you're doing with a certain amount of personal data from various consumers and how it impacts your business and how it contributes to your business and the percentage of your revenue that comes from that personal information. Some takeaways to consider is, first, think about your jurisdiction. Think about where you and your company are located. Think about where you're registered to do business. Think about where your customers are, because as you'll see in the Virginia language, if you're targeting services and products in Virginia, it's going to fall under, you're going to fall under the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act. Also think about the eligibility or the application of the laws to various entities. So think about, after you determine where you're located, what state's laws you need to pay attention to, think about how the various states determine who's covered by those data privacy laws. So do the laws apply to individuals or just entities? For entities, is there a size threshold? Is it based on revenues? Is it based on employees or number of customers? And then you should also check for exceptions. So some laws have exceptions for nonprofit entities or other governmental entities. But again, it is a state-by-state basis, and you need to check the individual state's laws regarding same. So now that we've identified potential laws that could apply to you or your businesses, step 3 is to implement the required protections and also take other reasonable measures to protect sensitive information. So please note that just as the different laws are structured differently and have different mechanisms for determining who falls under them, the various state laws have different areas of focus or goals. So the requirements and the obligations that the laws impose on individuals or businesses is going to vary. It's going to be structured differently, but nevertheless, you have to make sure that you comply with everything included therein. So first, by way of example, the GDPR establishes 7 principles for processing data. So these are the overall goals that the GDPR is designed to protect. These are the aims and what the law is striving to accomplish. So it includes lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, accessing data for legitimate purposes, data minimization, so making sure that entities or people only collect and process as much information as necessary. So we're trying to limit the spread of information or the access to personal information. And the GDPR also includes an accountability principle. So data controllers which is defined in the GDPR, are responsible for being able to demonstrate that they are compliant with this law. It also includes data security, so you're required to handle data securely by implementing appropriate technical and organizational measures. Technical measures under GDPR mean anything from requiring your employees to use two-factor authentication, as Anna talked about earlier, or storing information on encrypted drives, or making sure that they are otherwise protected. Organizational measures are things like staff trainings and adding a data privacy policy to employee handbooks to show that the organization is working to limit access to personal data. The GDPR also includes data protection by design and default. So under GDPR, everything a company or an entity does must by design and by default consider data protection. So it's basically requiring all organizations to consider data protection principles in the design of new products, in business activities, in its structure, and it brings to the forefront the idea of data protection. Under CCPA, the requirements are structured a little bit differently. The focus is on consumers again, and it's less, you'll see in this list, the focus is less on kind of collecting information and the amount of information, and more as to what consumers are able to do and almost the degree of control they have over their information. So CCPA requires entities to provide notice to consumers at or before they collect personal data. It requires that companies permit consumers to opt out, read and delete their personal information. It imposes requirements on entities to respond to consumer requests within specific timeframes. You have to enable consumers to change their privacy settings and change their mind at a different time and decide to opt out of the collection of personal information. CCPA also requires the disclosure of financial incentives for retaining or selling a consumer's personal data. So entities have to explain what they're using information for and how it is used by them, or any monetary value or benefits that they're gaining from collecting and using such information. And as part of records maintenance, which was another measure that Anna discussed in terms of maintaining records and destroying records appropriately, CCPA requires entities to maintain records of all access requests for 24 months. So they need to keep track of who accessed the data, who requested to access personal data, and how did the business respond. The Colorado Privacy Act requires individuals or entities, if you maintain PII, so the different definitions again coming into play for Colorado, you're required to develop a written policy to ensure that PII is destroyed or properly disposed of when it's no longer needed. You also have to maintain and implement security procedures and practices, taking into account the nature and size of your business and the type of PII you collect. And unless you agree to provide your own security protection for any PII you disclose to a third-party service provider, you have to require the third-party service provider to implement and maintain security procedures for the PII that's disclosed. So if your company has access to PII and you share that with another entity, another service provider, there's an obligation on you under the Colorado Act to make sure that that third party either maintains security procedures, or you have to agree to use your security procedures to protect that information. Lastly, under the Virginia law, the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act, this requires entities to limit the collection of data to that which is adequate, relevant, and reasonably necessary in relation to the purpose for which the data was procured or processed. But this focus is more on what the data is used for as opposed to the type of personal information or data that it is. The Virginia law also limits the use of collected data and mandates businesses to not process personal data for purposes that are neither reasonably necessary nor compatible with the disclosed purposes for which the data is processed, unless the entity obtains the consumer's consent. So entities have to, if you're collecting personal information, you have to do so for disclosed purposes. You have to identify what you're using it for. And if you go outside that scope, you need consumer consent. And similar to the other laws, the Virginia law also requires businesses to establish, implement, and maintain reasonable administrative, technical, and physical data security practices. So again, similar to in the GDPR, the mechanisms and organizational purposes that are required and the internal safeguards and procedures that companies are required to maintain, Virginia also imposes that obligation on businesses to maintain data privacy policies and protection mechanisms. So that covers our required actions as demonstrated under those 4 laws. But in terms of overall recommendations, we recommend that you and your small businesses pay attention to what laws apply to you, as I've said multiple times in this presentation, but given the piecemeal nature of the laws, unfortunately, it's very important. We recommend that you be as transparent as possible. Identify the information that you're collecting or processing. Identify the information that you have in your system or that you maintain on your internal databases. Communicate with your consumers or employees about what information you're maintaining. Provide notices that information is collected. So if you are processing personal data for your use or data collection, let consumers know and provide opt-outs for customers or consumers if required or feasible. So CCPA requires opt-outs, but it might be a good idea to consider if it's feasible for your company, that if you collect information, you permit consumers the opportunity to opt out of the collection of their data. Limit the collection and use of data based on what's reasonable and necessary for your business. So you'll see, as you saw from the 4 laws we used as examples, the laws also focus on limiting the scope of personal data collected to what's necessary for business, as well as the maintenance of such information. So how long it's held on for, who does it apply to? Next, ensure that data is protected. So the cybersecurity measures that Anna discussed will help protect information. So impose cybersecurity protections, storage policies, destruction policies, implement measures to keep information as secure as possible and prevent unauthorized access. And lastly, we don't have enough time in the time given for today's webinar to cover, but the last thing that that all businesses need to pay attention to is that you comply with data breach notification and reporting requirements in your jurisdiction. So most states have their own breach notification requirements. GDPR, CCPA, the Colorado Act, and the Virginia Act have their own requirements as well, but so do other states, even if they don't have a comprehensive data privacy law at this time. So make sure that you know what the breach notification requirements are, just in case in the event of a breach, you are well equipped to respond and respond within the confines of the law. So check deadlines, check the contents of notices. Some states will require a notice of a data breach to contain certain information. pay attention to which parties need to be notified. Is it just customers that were affected? Do you have to provide notice to any government entities or certain state offices? Those are all things that you should pay particular attention to as far as data breach notification requirements, solely for the purpose of being prepared in the event of a data breach. Obviously, Anna and I could only cover so much in the time we were given today. So please let us know if you have questions, or feel free to reach out after this or via email for both of us if you have follow-up questions. Anna, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or should we open up for any questions?
Well, I say we open it up for questions. There's a questions pod there that you all can type the questions into. Make sure that you send it to us. We'll be happy to answer it on air here, or if you'd like to send us an email later, our email addresses are right there for you all.
Apologies for the trouble with the slides and the progression there. I think we just had a delay on our system, but sorry about that. Peter, thank you for flagging for us. And Ken, in response to your question, we don't provide copies of the slides, but you will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the presentation, so you'll be able to hear the beginning and catch up that way. And again, let us know if when you listen to it, if you have any questions or are confused by anything that come out when you get to listen to it.
Well, all right. It sounds like we either bored everyone to death or covered everything so comprehensively that nobody has any questions. So, I guess we'll end it here. Thank you all for attending today. Like Emily said, we'll send out that email a little bit later with a copy of the recording that you can view later if you are so inclined. And again, if you have any other questions that you think of after, or just something that you don't really want us to answer on air, feel free to email us at the email addresses shown on the slides here. Oh, we do have one question. Any insight on the China privacy laws?
Anna, I can't say I have any insight on the China privacy laws. Mitchell, if you'd like to reach out with specific questions, I'm happy to touch base with you outside after I can get some more information for you. Anna and I can check with our other cybersecurity and data privacy colleagues to see if they have any insights as well. So that's something that we're happy to follow up with you on. And I apologize, I don't have answers for you at this time.
All right, it is 3 o'clock. Thank you all for joining again. Take care. We will see you next time.